Hello and welcome to the Heritage Foundation. I'm Andrew Parks, the Assistant Director of Lectures and Seminars. Thank you all for joining us today in our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. I just want to take the opportunity to remind everyone to silence cell phones. And for anyone watching online, you're welcome to submit questions by emailing speaker@heritage.org. Hosting today's program is James Shirk. He's the Research Fellow in Labor Economics in the Center for Data Analysis here at the Heritage Foundation. He researches ways to promote competition and mobility in the workforce. And with that, I'll turn it over to James.
Thank you. A hot topic of debate recently across the country and in many states has been right-to-work laws. These laws that require, or rather prevent workers from being required to pay union dues as a condition of employment. This is something that Wisconsin recently passed a right-to-work law. A few years earlier, Michigan, my home state, to the surprise of many, passed a right-to-work law, a very historic development. And there's a lot of controversy over what these do. So we've published some new research that's out today that I'll be discussing in just a minute, analyzing the effect of right-to-work laws on wages. And to discuss this, we also have Chris Kapenga, who is a state senator in the Wisconsin legislature, recently elected to the state senate, was formerly in the state assembly, and as a state assemblyman was the author of Wisconsin right-to-work law. And we also have Vincent Vernuccio, who's the director of labor policy for the Mackinac Center in Michigan. And the three of us will be discussing the effect of right-to-work on wages. I'll be presenting this research, and then the senator and Mr. Vernuccio will be discussing how right-to-work has affected the two most recent states to have enacted it. But on the topic of right to work, this is a very popular position nationwide across all partisan and ideological splits. You can see we've got up here some polling from the Gallup organization. They did this last summer, and this is actually fairly consistent with their historical polling. You can go back to the 1950s and you find numbers very similar to this. Americans believe in free association. Whether or not you support the National Rifle Association or the Sierra Club or the local Kiwanis, Americans believe if you want to join that organization, you've got that right, but you shouldn't be forced to join it. You'd be hard-pressed to find many NRA members who believe that their fellow gun owners ought to be forced to join the NRA and pay dues, even if the NRA is hard at work defending their Second Amendment rights. But when it comes to unions, well, most Americans agree with this principle. Many union advocates and supporters do not. And this has had effects on public policy. Despite the fact that almost three-quarters of Americans believe that union dues ought to be voluntary, that Americans ought not be fired for deciding to belong to a union, only about half the country, 25 states, and then some local right-to-work laws in Kentucky, only about half the country has this. And a natural question that you would ask would be, why is that? In a democracy, generally speaking, the laws tend to reflect the feelings of the public, intermediated through their elected representatives. Why is it that legislators in half the country aren't going along with what their constituents are supporting? This is a debate that Wisconsin just had, that in Maine the legislature just voted down a right-to-work law. In Missouri they're going to be voting in a few weeks on whether or not to override the governor's veto of a right-to-work law. New Mexico, across the country, we're seeing that legislators, some of them, like Senator Kapenga, have voted for right-to-work, but others say that this is a bad idea. And the core argument is that basically right-to-work laws lower wages. This is a figure put out by the Economic Policy Institute. It is a left-wing think tank. Most people don't realize it's actually a union-backed think tank. Richard Trumka is the head of the AFL-CIO. He's the chair of their board of directors as well. They have 9 other union presidents on their board of directors. But the Economic Policy Institute has put out a number of studies basically showing what this shows, is that in states where union density dropped the most, wage growth was slowest over the past several decades. And they also put out studies like this where they're very quick to acknowledge a point that almost everyone on the right-to-work side of the debate makes is, look, you can't just jump to this conclusion. You can't just immediately say, okay, wages are different in right-to-work states because other things are different. You've got different demographic makeups, you've got different educational makeups, especially you've got different costs of living. And so you can't simply make this apples to oranges comparison. You have to control for this. And this is the results from a study where they do basically doing just that. And this is evidence that they've submitted before Congress in congressional testimony. They've submitted it before basically this study before state legislatures and state legislative testimony. I know that Senator Capenga heard very similar numbers when he was being asked to vote on right to work in Wisconsin. And what they basically show is that you can more or less interpret these numbers, if you can see them, as percentage point changes. They're not exactly that, but for our purposes, close enough. And what it shows in the first column is don't account for anything, 13% lower wages in right-to-work states. Account for demographic and individual, labor market type variables like your education, your age, things like that, which we would expect younger workers tend to make less than older workers, and more educated workers tend to make more. The gap falls down to 9%. And then throw in that third column there, the third and fourth column are two different measures of basically state living cost. Add those as control variables. And it seems like even controlling for that, and the unions have made this point time and time again, that they claim that wages are about 3% lower in right-to-work states. And this, to many legislators and policymakers, has been a persuasive argument. That's why we've got, I think, a major reason why we've got about half the country hasn't passed these right-to-work laws. This argument that, generally we believe in free association, but unions try and promote higher wages and better working conditions. If we pass right to work, there's going to be fewer union members, and this has economic side effects that hurt everyone. Therefore, while we normally believe in free association, we'll put an asterisk next to unions and say that we're actually going to force you to pay union dues. Now, that is something that I, as an economist, find a very strange conclusion. I went to graduate school for economics, had a concentration in labor economics, and the way all the papers and the economic evidence I read treats unions is as a labor monopoly. That the way unions try to operate is as a monopoly, essentially, who controls the local labor market. They try and gain control over the supply of labor, get everyone into their union, and when they can do that, they can control the supply of labor and driving up its price. But that higher price, it gets passed on to consumers. In the higher wages, the consumers pay for it. And because consumers are paying higher prices, A, the consumers are worse off, and B, they're selling fewer goods and services. So more workers get pushed into the non-union sector of the economy, which slightly, supply and demand, lowers wages in that sector. And the economic research is fairly conclusive that the overall losses to the economy are that you might have gains if you're on the inside of the union, but overall the economy is worse off. So the claim that you're lowering average wages is very dissonant to my ears as a labor economist. And on top of that, union membership has been not doing the best in the recent decades. Union membership is down fairly consistently, and so they don't even have that many labor markets where they have their monopoly. So how in the world do you get this finding that the states with right-to-work laws and fewer union membership, and generally the states with the decline in union membership have worse wages? Well, I and a few others have taken a look at this. The next two slides I'm going to credit Adam Ozimek, who with Moodys.com. He posted a blog post with these slides. And this is actually not just the change in union membership since 1979, but just 1979 union membership and wage growth. Lo and behold, it seems like the states that had the largest drop in union membership since the 70s were the states that had the largest union membership in the 70s. And those are the states that had the slowest wage and compensation growth. That doesn't quite fit in with the story that the Economic Policy Institute is telling. So why would states with higher union membership have lower wage growth? Well, it turns out they have a lot lower employment growth. The jobs have grown the slowest in those states that had the highest union density to begin with. And so the sort of simplistic story, that chart that I showed you before, actually turns out to be a lot more nuanced and less favorable to the unions than what the Economic Policy Institute put out. But what about the more rigorous analysis? Well, we set out at the Heritage Foundation to replicate their research. Interestingly, surprisingly, I thought professional standards were, as an economist, you share your data with anyone who asks. They wouldn't share their data with me, so I couldn't exactly replicate what they did because they just weren't willing to share their data and their code. Draw into that what inferences you may, but I repeatedly emailed them and asked, and after initial correspondences, when I was like, well, would you share your data and code, they just stopped responding to me. But I went out to replicate. They did use a broadly speaking, publicly available data source that they made some adjustments to, so I used the same underlying data source. And one of the key things you've got to take account of is living costs. Because you can remember from that map, pretty much the entire South is right to work. We can debate how you discuss Kentucky and Missouri, but bracketing that, the entire South has right to work, and the entire Northeast is not. Well, it costs a whole lot more to live in New York City or in Boston than it does to live in Shreveport, Louisiana, or in Nashville, Tennessee. $1 is going to buy you more in a lot of these right-to-work states, and this chart shows it here visually. The gray bar in the middle is basically average living cost. What we've done here is rank states from lowest living cost to highest living cost, with the states at the top being the highest living costs. And on either side, you can see which are the right to work and which are the non-right to work. There's only one right to work state with living costs above the national average, and that's Virginia. All other 24 right to work states are below average living costs. And conversely, as you can see, New York, California, Massachusetts, Hawaii, the states with above average living costs, those are all the states with the forced union dues. And one of the findings economists have made is that wages more or less track one for one with living costs. Once you control for workers' skills and their human capital and abilities, and any sort of local amenities like, do you have really pleasant weather that might cause people to want to live near you or live near the beach? Once you account for those things, wages move one for one with living costs. So the average New Yorker might have 13% higher wages, but they're not actually getting 13% more goods and services. They're actually making the same as the average American, once you account for the fact that rent in New York City is really, really, really high. And so this turns out to make a major effect on the analysis. So what we can do here, I'll just summarize these. I won't ask you to strain your eyes to try and see, but the first four columns are replicating what the Economic Policy Institute did. And these numbers here, I've converted them from log points into percentage points. So this is just straight percentage point answers. And we more or less, we got close to what they did. They wouldn't share their data using the publicly available data. We got close to what they were finding, not quite as negative effect of right to work, but fairly close. And then you'd have to look into their appendix. They didn't talk about this at all in their report, but in their appendix it's revealed. Their cost of living variable only counts for 3/4 of the difference in living costs. It doesn't account for the entire difference in living costs. It expects that if wages go up 10% in a state, or if living costs go up 10% in a state, wages are only 7.5% higher, not the 10% that economists have actually found. They're not fully controlling for it. They include it as a control variable. They talk about it and saying we're accounting for living costs, but their actual, the mathematical guts of their model only explains about 3/4 of this difference. Now, normally when you've got differences in purchasing power, either across time or over states, what economists will do is adjust the variables first for the differences in purchasing power and then run their analysis. So usually you run the analysis on inflation-adjusted dollars rather than the same dollars over time. And so that's what we did in the next column. That one change makes their entire results go away. I used the exact same model they used, exact same control variables. The only thing I did differently was adjusted the wages for differences in living costs, and all of a sudden the results disappear. So this claim that right-to-work laws are these awful, horrible, terrible things for workers, which you hear constantly from unions and then from groups like the Economic Policy Institute, you just change to do a more accurate reflection of living cost differences, and it goes away. Now, the next two columns there, I just broke it out between private sector and the government. Now, why would we do that? Well, we would expect wages to affect living costs differently in the private sector and government. In the government, unions affect wages primarily by electing their political allies and getting favorable contracts. In the private sector, you affect wages, how? By using the union monopoly strength and power. So in the private sector, what we see is there's nothing, negative 0.1%, totally non-significant. But in government, wages are about 5% lower in right-to-work states. Now, personally, I would argue that is a benefit of right-to-work laws. We know that in almost all states, government employees make more than equivalently skilled private sector workers. We shouldn't be raising sales taxes and property taxes to force the average American to provide a higher standard of living for government employees than they themselves receive. I would say that for a lot of hard-strapped state budgets, the fact that you're lowering government wages is, in fact, a good thing. But private sector, there's nothing. There's just nothing there. And then the final specification is a different measure of wages that includes tips and commissions. And that, again, there's no effect there. And so all these arguments against right-to-work lowering wages really evaporate when you take a look under the hood of these studies. But what about benefits of right-to-work, besides just the free association benefits? Well, what we have here is a nice little natural experiment that has been conducted recently. Kentucky, as I mentioned, has a number of counties that are passing right-to-work. How has this affected their job situation? This county right here, Warren County, was the first county in Kentucky to pass it. Basically, think Bowling Green. That pretty much the entire county is Bowling Green, Kentucky. They passed this in December 2014. In the next 3 months, almost 30 different economic development projects representing 3,600 jobs contacted them and told them, hey, we're kind of interested in locating you now. You were scratched off our list because you didn't have right to work. But now that you've gone right to work, we're interested. Since then, as of May of this year, I've heard from the Bowling Green Chamber of Commerce. It's been reported publicly that number's gone up to 47 companies representing about 5,000 potential jobs. Now, Bowling Green has a total employment of about 50,000 workers. So these projects represent about a 10% potential increase in their overall employment if they were to land them all. Projects that they were not eligible for because they did not have right to work. The businesses just didn't want to deal with that strife. Now that's an anecdote. Unions can rightfully point out, well, this is just one county. Maybe it was something in the weather or in the water or something. And so I did the same sort of analysis we did to wages, to the unemployment rates. And what it shows is when you don't account for anything, unemployment rates are about a half percentage point lower in right-to-work states. When you account for everything, they're over. So when you're accounting for the age and the education and other factors we'd expect to affect unemployment, the unemployment rates are about a percentage point lower in right-to-work states. Now, the Economic Policy Institute didn't attempt to replicate this chart, so I'm assuming that means they did and found the same things I did and didn't want to talk about it. But what we see from right to work is these scare stories about wages falling. It's really a lot of smoke and mirrors. You dig under the hood of the model, and they're just not fully accounting for living costs, despite billing their models as doing that. But we do see, both anecdotally and empirically, very strong evidence on job creation. And on top of that, you've just got the free associational benefits. If I don't support an organization, why should I be forced to financially subsidize their operations? And with that, I think that's a pretty powerful case for right to work. But I'm going to turn the mic over to two speakers from states that have recently passed right to work to talk about the experiences they've had. And after both the speakers have gone, we'll take Q&A from the audience.
Thank you, James. It's a pleasure to be here at the Heritage. Good grief, we spend a ton of time looking at the research that these guys do, so thanks for doing what you do. Thanks for inviting me to a swamp in the middle of summer. I appreciate that. Went for a run last night, and before I even stepped out of the door, I think I sweat through my jogging outfit. It is the right to work thing it is a big deal. It's been a big deal in Wisconsin for a long time. And I think what I want to do is take a little bit of time to walk you through a couple of reasons, why right to work in Wisconsin. I want to walk you through, too, what we ran into with objections, because I think that plays very well into what James has been working through with his numbers. Just really quick on my background, just so you know, I am a policy wonk type of guy. I'm a CPA by trade. Spent 8 years in public accounting, the last several with Arthur Andersen. And then I bought, I've owned a couple of companies. I still have that. But I jumped into politics probably about, it was actually 2009. I started running for office, was elected in 2011 with Governor Walker, came in. So as you have seen in Wisconsin, we've had some interesting things going on over the last several years. So right to work is something that we actually looked at right away when we came into office back in 2010, 2011. And really what we're doing is we're looking at a kind of an overall blueprint for how do we take Wisconsin, which, as you know, if you look at the history of our state, progressive is we brought into existence the state income tax, unemployment insurance, heavy things like that are very progressive. So we looked at it, and we've got a new crop of, I'll call citizen legislators, who said what we need to do is we slowly need to take away the concept of government is the provider to government is limited. And, that's the Heritage Foundation is at its core. That's what you guys are about. But so we looked at it, and right to work was in the recipe for that. As you know, we started out with Act 10, which was essentially right to work for the public sector. And we fought that battle, and I think have led the charge in the United States for what states are doing now. And that was a huge, huge battle for us. but we knew it had to be done. We've done some income tax reform over the last couple of sessions, but coming up into this session, we saw right to work. That is really the elephant in the room. We have to deal with it. And so we started actually before the session even started in, okay, what is our message going to be? What things are we going to encounter? We looked at a bunch of stuff that James has done. And the big driver is, again, back to our blueprint, over 70% of our budget really relates to dependency on government versus dependency on the individual. So we knew that we had to take care of this issue. Here are the things that we ran into. And this is the interesting part about what these gentlemen do is huge for us because we need the numbers, but what we have to do is effectively communicate that to get the message across. So we have to take the numbers and we have to translate it into people. And we don't have a ton of time, and I would have loved to stand up in committee and on the floor and with my colleagues in their offices and gone through this type of thing because the analysis is fascinating. It's fascinating. And we ran into the same studies. But what we had to do was we had to take this and make it real for people. So what we did is the first issue that we ran into was the opposition actually came at this from a different perspective. We started out by saying this is about workers' freedom. And this is very personal to me because back when I was 19 years old, I worked for an electrical contractor, and I wasn't aware of right to work or unionization. It was just, I took my job, I went in, the guy said, here's your offer. I took it with him and went to work. And the first paycheck, I had these deductions on it, and I couldn't figure out, what is this? So I went to the payroll person and said, hey, I think there's a mistake here. And the payroll person said, no, this is actually your union dues. And I didn't even know about it. And I said, well, I didn't ask to be in the union. And she said, well, you have two options. You can either take the deduction or you can go find another job because the state law actually says that this is the way it's going to be. And that just as a 19-year-old, a very unpolitical 19-year-old, it never sat right with me. It always bothered me. And so when I came into office, my first piece of lit, right to work, was right on the front of that thing. It was a major piece that we had to do. But it's about worker freedom, and it was interesting to see as we went through this. The first debate I had actually on NPR, and I think most of us know where they lean, it wasn't with me, but they actually tried to come at me, the Democrat who was arguing against me, came at me with worker freedom and said, you're getting government involved in an employer and an employee relationship. And I kind of laughed and I said, well, I think that's already in place. I said, if we had a true free market here, the employer would have just as much of a right to say, no, I'm not going to have a union in my business as the employees do to unionize. But that doesn't exist. And why is that? It's because government's already involved. So the worker freedom thing, what it really ended up coming down to is, and we use this in debate too, it's really not a struggle with workers, it's the union bosses. That's what our colleagues on the opposite side were upset about, because guess who funds campaigns? And we had the statistics for a lot of our debate opponents sitting there ready if they pulled out that card, because we always hear about, they always pull out the Koch brothers and, all these bad ALEC, all these foundations that always obviously are from the right. So we had it laid out how much of their campaign contributions came from the unions in case we had to pull that card out. And I think they found out about it because they never brought that up in the debate. So that was interesting. So the workers' freedom, that's really the angle we came at. Workers will make less. We used your statistics. This was an interesting one. So to take all these numbers and, again, bring it back to people, here's how we approached it. So they brought up the argument. They said, you know what, in I call them forced union states, but in non-right-to-work states, people make more money. And I said, you know what, you're absolutely right. They do. And they would kind of sit and look at me. And, okay, good, we agree on something. Great. And so then what I did is I had to bring it, again, cost of living adjustment. If you start throwing COLA out, the average person's eyes glaze over and they fall asleep. So I just said, okay, let's take it. Have you ever been to Chicago? Have you been to a Starbucks in Chicago? Have you said that their chai tea latte venti non-fat is way more expensive there than it is in Milwaukee or Madison? And everybody's like, oh, totally. I don't even go there because it's so expensive. And I said, well, do you think the average worker in Chicago makes more money? And they're like, well, they have to. And I said, okay. So at the end of the day, do you understand? You have to have both pieces here. You can't just say they make more. You have to look at what their expenses are. So I said, they may have a bigger paycheck, but right to work states, people have a bigger bank account. So that's what we kept coming back to. Average family, $2,000, bigger bank account at the end of every year. That was what really helped us win that argument. Again, we didn't get too much into the details of the stats because we didn't have the time. But again, it was very helpful. The loss of workforce because workers will move to other states to get paid more. And this was interesting because it was a study commissioned by the unions from a local professor at a university. And he used the study you referenced as kind of his support. And as I read through, he made assumptions based on a couple of facts, but he didn't back up his assumptions with facts. He just assumed that people would just buy into his analysis. And a lot of the public did. Obviously, the media was constantly quoting him, saying, well, you've got a pretty smart guy here who's quoting all these facts, and then he thinks that this is going to drive workers out. And what we did is we said, okay, let's look at how many of you have a lawnmower here? Okay. What kind of engine is on the lawnmower? It's usually a Kohler or a Briggs & Stratton. So most people know Briggs & Stratton. Briggs & Stratton, when the union came and tried to unionize and won the union vote, Briggs & Stratton packed up their manufacturing and moved to a different state. So we could find a very prominent local company that we said, here's what happens. This is not good. Right to work states actually gain jobs, and then we could bring in some statistics that these guys put together for us that showed that that's actually not the fact. But this professor tried to use this assumption that because wages were going to go down, and they kept going back to wages are going to decrease if you become right to work. You're going to hurt the worker. And we said, no, that's not true at all. We showed that wages increase at a higher rate when you're in a right to work state. The other thing we ran into was companies want to move to right to work states because they want to pay people less. So that was interesting. So they were saying that, site selectors, we all know who they are and what they do. Site selectors, this is one of almost their standard questions is, are you a right to work state, are you not? And there's plenty of companies who have moved to states who they have specifically said, we're going here because this is a key component to it. So what we did is we said businesses don't go to right to work states because they want to pay less. Because again, the statistics don't back that up. Companies go to right to work states because there's more flexibility in the workplace and because their workers can be more efficient. And again, we brought that back to why is that? Because the worker is empowered with personal liberty and with the ability to make more decisions on their own versus having this union contract overrule things. So that was another interesting argument. Right to work states are more dangerous. That was the last big one that they threw out at us. So what we did is we actually pulled all the workers' comp data from non-right to work states, right to work states. And again, me being a CPA, I created the spreadsheet myself, and I had a blast doing it, but I couldn't show that to my colleagues because, again, their eyes glaze over. But we showed that the numbers proof out that actually in right to work states there were fewer incidences and accidents. And I know you referenced that too in what you said. So those were the things that we ran into. And again, we always had to bring it back to people. What does it mean for the person? And we look at the Democrats, and speaking as a Republican, the Democrats are always so effective because they always take it to people. So we wanted to make sure we did the same thing. The impact on Wisconsin, this is pretty new to Wisconsin. but we are able to see some immediate things, and it was pretty cool. The day after we passed right to work, I got a call from the CFO of a company who I know, and they actually own a conglomeration of companies, 14, 15 companies. And he said, Chris, I just wanted you to know, because you guys passed right to work, we've been kind of waiting in the wings, but we're moving one of our manufacturing companies from Minnesota to Wisconsin. So we just wanted to make sure you knew that, so you had evidence that this is a big deal for companies. So that was one thing. We had another company, Badger Meter, who we actually signed the right to work bill at Badger Meter with Governor Walker. But he said we were going to actually look at moving 100 employees to another state because they were a right to work state. We have more flexibility there. But we are going to keep those employees here, and they actually looked at expanding too. And then a constituent of mine, he just, last week, he said, hey, Chris, wondering if next week you can come do another ribbon cutting for an expansion we're having. Well, this guy, actually, when I knocked his door for the first time in 2010, he chewed on me for about 45 minutes to an hour about how terrible Wisconsin was with the business climate and how we just weren't listening to business owners. And I said, Dick, give it some time. Trust me on this one. We've got a different crop of people coming in here. We're going to make changes. And they, instead of moving operations to Kentucky, they have grown in the state of Wisconsin, and I've been to 2 ribbon cuttings now for expansions there. So proof positive that what we're doing is working. And interesting enough, I actually have this week, I've got some legislators from Missouri who are coming out to talk to me just about, hey, kind of walk us through why you guys did what you did and help us understand better so that we can make an informed decision on what to do with this veto. Wisconsin business environment, this is pretty cool too. We've always been ranked in the middle, lower middle tier or the bottom tier constantly. That's just where we've been for the last probably decade. CEO Magazine, we're now 14th. And the cool one for us is Manpower. So Manpower does a study on finding a job. We are now number 4. We're the 4th best state for finding a job. That is powerful. We don't have a jobs issue anymore in the state of Wisconsin. We have a worker issue, finding workers, which is a really neat transition from 4 or 5 years ago when I took office. Everybody was struggling to find jobs. But we don't have a jobs issue anymore. We have a worker issue. That's a different subject. Over the last year, this was pretty powerful too, because as you know, Wisconsin is a very heavy manufacturing state. And southeastern Wisconsin, which is kind of the Milwaukee, Waukesha, it's pretty much the Milwaukee region. We were just named, we had the highest growth in manufacturing jobs of any metro area in the United States in the last year. And it's because of things we've been doing. And we can definitely attribute that to right to work. That was a piece of the puzzle that has really helped us. So very strong evidence just from on the ground people, businesses, and people who are getting jobs too. These are good paying jobs. That right to work is good for a state. I think it's good for the nation as a whole because, it gets back to the individual liberty and freedom of a person to choose if they want to associate or not with this. So that's what I had. And the UI rate in Wisconsin also is 4.6%. So we're below the national average. We're doing great there too.
Hi, I'm Vinny Vernuccio, Director of Labor Policy for the Mackinac Center out of Michigan. James, Heritage, thank you so much for the invitation to come speak. And for everybody else in the audience, you've heard from the economist, you've heard from the CPA, now you get to hear from the lawyer. So I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. Before I go on, let's just do a real quick definition of what is right to work. Right to work simply means a union can't get a worker fired for not paying them. Doesn't affect collective bargaining in any other way. Workers, unions, they can still negotiate with their employer over wages, hours, working conditions. Anything they could negotiate over before right to work, they can negotiate over after right to work. They simply can't say, you have to pay us or you're going to lose your job. Well, let me tell you what was going on in Michigan from about 2000 to 2010, give or take. It was Michigan's lost decade. We had some of the highest unemployment in the country. We lost over 860,000 payroll jobs during that period. Our wages were falling. Between 2001 and 2012, wages in Michigan fell by almost $2,500 a year, inflation adjusted. Rest of the country, wages went up by almost $3,000. We were losing population. There's a saying in Michigan, last one in Michigan, turn out the lights. And some people really took that to heart. I moved in 2012, right as the unions were putting a ballot measure on the November 2012 ballot to amend the Constitution to allow union collective bargaining agreements, government union collective bargaining agreements, to have an effective veto over legislation. They were going to give government collective bargaining agreements the power of the Constitution. And Civics 101, you have a constitutional amendment, you have and then you have a piece of legislation which wins, the constitutional amendment. So it's against this backdrop that I moved, and I was an optimist. I knew Michigan would be coming back, but part of me was, well, I'm moving, I'm taking this new job. I'm moving my soon-to-be wife out here. I'm buying a home. I hope stuff works out, especially with this proposal too. Well, it did. Voters took one look at that, and it went down by 15 points. They said no. That eventually led to the conversation on right to work, and in December 2012, Michigan, the state with the 5th highest union membership rate, the birthplace of the UAW, long considered a labor stronghold, finally gave workers the freedom to choose. And the effect was felt almost immediately. The next month, Senator was talking about site selectors. Site Selection magazine published, there should be a significant increase in the number of projects Michigan receives because they are no longer being eliminated in the early stages of searches. Now, we've heard about right to work and population growth. You have higher population growth in the right to work stage. You have higher wage growth. You have lower unemployment, more jobs. At its core, right to work is about freedom. And when job creators and workers look at states, one of the first things is right to work is a checkbox. Does it have a right to work law or not? Now, if the state has a horrible regulatory business climate, if they have incredibly high taxes, chances are jobs probably aren't going there. But if they have a competitive tax climate, if they have competitive regulatory environment, then jobs are going to be attracted. The problem is that without a right to work law, without that checkbox, most site selectors won't even look past, do you have worker freedom or not? Well, so what happened? Well, Michigan unemployment went down, led the nation by almost 10 points since June 2009. We're now at 5.3%. Unfortunately, Wisconsin's still beating us, but we have a lot to offer.
You guys are used to that,
Yeah.
especially in football.
No comment. Well, the next closest to us was the right to work state of Indiana, which had a 6-point drop. In May alone, Michigan added 6,000 manufacturing jobs. And up to that point, it was almost 13,000 for the year. Indiana, our right to work neighbor, added 2,000 that month, 5,000 for the year. And you can contrast that with, you know what, I will go ahead and say forced unionism. The forced unionism state of Illinois, which lost 2,000 in the same month. So the right to work states that are gaining these jobs, the forced unionism states that are losing. Now remember I told you I was a little nervous about, just a little nervous, about buying a home, relocating my life to Michigan. Well, that gamble paid off. Right now, Michigan home values have grown the 7th highest in the country in the last 5 years. And I'll tell you from personal experience, my home value has skyrocketed since I bought it in 2012. Things are going well in Michigan. Wages are going up. From March 2013, when the right to work law took effect, until early 2015, Michigan earnings have gone up by 5.4%. You compare that to the national average at 3.7. Oklahoma, which passed right to work earlier in the 2000s, the year that right to work went into effect, before it was $539 was the average pay per week. By the end of 2002, after right to work, it went up to $551. In 2012, it was $801 per week. In Indiana, before they passed right to work in 2001, average weekly wages was $774. By the end of 2012, after they passed right to work, average wages were $793. I mean, so much for right to work lowering wages or right to work for less. So we've heard where they got it. It's COLA. Now, Senator was talking about Starbucks. I grew up in New York City. Do you know how much rent is for the average apartment in New York City? It's about $3,400 a month. You can get a shoebox apartment, not even a one-bedroom, a studio apartment costs you $2,000 a month rent in New York City. You get a decent house in Alabama, the mortgage, on average, the right-to-work state of Alabama, $800 a month. Starts to put things in perspective of why those workers in New York are getting paid more. The dollar does not nearly go as far. Well, James's nemesis, EPI, just released their 2015 family budget calculator. And they went through and, according to their calculations, went through several metropolitan areas and estimated how much a typical family would need to spend on rent, food, the bare basics. All 10 of their most expensive cities are enforced unionism states. This is the group that's saying, well, workers aren't making more in right-to-work states. Their own data is showing them that when you calculate it correctly, that it's because the costs are more. And when you factor in that cost of living, workers in right-to-work states are making about 4% more. And the final thing that happens in right-to-work states, which makes the unions, I'll say, pause when they hear this, is that right-to-work can actually make unions stronger. Right-to-work means that unions can't take their own membership for granted. They can't force them to pay. So they actually have to prove their worth to their membership. They have to compete. And we know that competition can make you stronger. Last year, the right-to-work state of Indiana tied for the #1 state of adding new union members. Last year, they added 50,000 new union members. Michigan lost some, and the forced unionism states actually beat the right-to-work states last year in new union members. But you go back a couple years, and you see that it goes back and forth. Some years, right-to-work states actually outpace non-right-to-work states or forced unionism states as far as new union members. Now, I can just spout numbers out, yeah, but I don't want you to take my word for it. I want to read you a couple quotes. This is something I never understood, that people think right-to-work hurts unions. To me, it helps them. You don't have to belong if you don't want to. So if I go to an organizing drive, I can tell these workers, if I don't like this arrangement, you don't have to belong. Versus, if we get 50% of you, then all of you have to belong, whether you like it or not. I don't even like the way that sounds. Anybody know who said that? Gary Castile, the UAW's current secretary-treasurer. In Michigan, the AFL-CIO president, after Right to Work passed, said, we don't know what to expect. What we can continue to do is explain to our members why membership is of value. Same thing, same sentiment from the membership director of the state's largest union, the MEA, the teachers union. Have we had to increase our effort on that? And he's talking about communicating with his members about why they should support his union. Sure, we have, and we're stronger because of it. Now, I'd like to say that they're taking these sentiments to heart. I think some are, some aren't. We have run into a few speed bumps with worker freedom in Michigan. First of which was that the law was passed in December 2012, but didn't actually take effect until March 2013. So during that period, unions were able to extend contracts, in some cases, up to 10 years, a decade of forced unionism, because the right to work law did not affect current contracts. They also established windows, or said that workers could only exercise their right to work rights during certain times of year. For the teachers union, it's the month of August, which we just passed. And the one that sprang up on us this year, that kind of boggles the mind, is we had the teachers union again used to accept resignations to their general mailbox. In June, they put a nondescript disclaimer on their website and said that they will no longer be accepting resignations to the mailbox, where they had thousands and thousands of resignations historically, and would now only accept it to a new mailbox. Not coincidentally, the mailbox was Mailbox 51, P.O. Box 51 at the local post office, which you can make allusions to Area 51 all you want. So this is what we're seeing. But at the end of the day, even as the unions try whatever they can to get around the right to work law, we are seeing more jobs in Michigan. We are seeing higher home values. We are seeing more population growth. And I will tell you that the attitude in the Wolverine state is optimistic. We are optimistic about the future, and it's due in large part to our worker freedom. So thank you very much.
All right, we've got some time for questions. Was there someone with a microphone? Gentleman in the back, if you'll stand up when you have your question and state your name and affiliation.
My name's Connor Wolf. I'm a reporter at the Daily Caller News Foundation. My question is regards to kind of the averages of all the right-to-work states. Upon passing a right-to-work law, do we see wages change in that case compared to where wages were before the right-to-work law was passed? And could this be a control for future reports?
It's the kind of thing that both the folks on the left and myself on the right, and academic economists as well, basically say that we expect the effect to take many years to play itself out. The way you'd expect right to work to affect wages would be on the upside by attracting new businesses and putting more upward demand for labor. Alabama has more auto manufacturing plants with pretty good wages precisely because of the right to work law. But they didn't all move there as soon as the right to work law was passed, I think in Alabama's case in the 40s. And similarly, the union argument is that you're weakening the power of unions and they can't get as good contracts and putting downward pressure. But in both cases, this is something that's going to take place over a number of years. I was actually quite surprised to see the numbers out of Bowling Green. It was a very strong response in that county. But it's something at a statewide level that you would expect to play itself out over a number of years. So what the EPI studies did, what I did, is basically took Indiana and Michigan out of the data set after the right to work law was passed, saying, let's wait a few years. Now, I think 5 years from now, we'll be able to look back and then to actually get some numbers and take a look. But it's not something you'd expect to have an effect the next month or 2 months later. I don't know if either of you want to comment on that.
Yeah, Connor, I can send you some of the numbers that we ran as far as the Michigan earnings growth and also some of the average weekly earnings for Oklahoma and Indiana. Unfortunately, we haven't done Wisconsin yet because it's still pretty new. But yeah, I mean, we are seeing increase in wages, and we've compared that to national averages. And like I said, Michigan is far outpacing the national average for wage growth. So they can go back and forth, but at the end of the day, when you look at it, the tagline of workers will make less after a right-to-work law is passed is simply untrue, just by looking at the last several right-to-work states after they passed the law.
My name's Joel. You hear me? My name's Joel Mandelman. I'm an attorney here in town. It has been stated, or I've heard, and I think even once here, that a lot of large corporations, Fortune 100, Fortune 500 companies, are very lukewarm to right-to-work laws because they'd rather negotiate with one union than with 10,000 or 20,000 employees, and that they see right-to-work laws as disruptive of labor peace and therefore are very unhelpful in getting these laws enacted in other states. Is that a correct statement of fact, or is that myth?
Well, right to work wouldn't have any effect on the number of unions they're negotiating with. That's, the only thing right to work affects is whether or not you're forced to pay dues. The size of the bargaining unit, whether or not you have to bargain, that's a entirely different question. I think it may be more of an issue to the extent you're correct on that. I mean, we at Heritage, we're C3. We don't lobby. We put out research on these issues, but I've not, we have been active in the lobbying campaigns. But to the extent that you have an effect of big unionized companies not wanting right to work, it may be that right to work puts more pressure on the unions to deliver for their members. That, without right to work, basically it's a captive audience they can tax and raise the dues. The UAW recently hiked the dues 25%, and that's something Michigan members have an opt-out for. But if you're in Ohio, if you're in Pennsylvania, if you're in many of these other states, basically if you aren't willing to switch jobs, they can, raise your dues, and you have to pay up, and they don't have a lot of pressure to deliver, high-quality services. I mean, in theory, the union officers are elected in these elections, but they're so heavily slanted towards the incumbent slates that, in a number of unions, they're practically, the presidency is passed from father to son, and it's more of an inherited dynasty than than anything we'd call a democratic election. So it may be that with the right to work and that, the option of exit, where the workers can decide that, if they're not seeing value, they're going to go elsewhere, that the unions feel more pressure to actually deliver something at the negotiating table.
We actually, it's interesting you brought that up. We did not hear that. We had some larger corporations who are unionized. They did come to us and they said publicly, we have to be careful here because we have our workforce. And obviously the workforce, the union workforce, is not in favor of right to work because of what they're told from the union bosses. It's going to decimate them. But the reality was they said, just so you know, we can't come out publicly to back this, but we think this is going to be a good thing for us as a company and also for our workers. So that's what we heard from the large corporations.
Hi, I'm Sasha Gong from Voice of America. My question is that, how does the right to work law affect government employee union, since government employee union is now the majority of the union membership?
Sure. A typical right to work law, and Wisconsin was a little bit different, so I won't talk about Act 10. I can let the senators speak to that much more authoritatively. But a typical right to work law for government employees, government employee unions, is the exact same as a typical right to work law for the private sector. It simply says that a union can't get a worker fired, whether it's private sector or public sector. The union can't go in and say that this person has to pay us or they have to lose their job. And that's all right to work does in both public and private. Government workers, depending on the civil service laws or anything ancillary, can still negotiate over wages, hours, and working conditions, same as they can in the private sector. But as far as the difference, for a typical right to work law, there really is none.
Now, the effect I found in my study was there were different wage effects for the government and in the private sector. And I think the reason behind this might be the government unions are very intensely political organizations because they can do something that the private sector unions can't do. They can elect their own boss. If you're in the private sector, you've got to deal with whoever the manager is, and that's who you bargain against. But if they can elect a friendly politician, the unions can control both sides of the negotiating table. And instead of the politicians trying to get a good deal for the taxpayers and efficient services at lower cost, the politicians may be more interested in paying off someone who's a major contributor into their campaign, not necessarily in dollars, but in terms of boots on the ground and activism and get out the vote and the like. And so if you look at the Department of Labor puts online at www.unionreports.gov, a lot of unions are required to file these financial disclosure forms. And the typical private sector union will spend somewhere between 5 and 15% of their overall budget on politics and lobbying. But if you look at the government unions, a lot of these government unions, at least those that are subject to these reports, are spending a quarter to a third of their budgets on politics and lobbying. So if you look at the American Federation of State, County, Municipal Employees, if you look at the Service Employees International Union, the teachers' unions, huge portion of their budget goes to these politics and lobbying expenditures because it gives them something that the private sector unions can't get. They can directly control who they negotiate against and get a sweetheart contract. And so right-to-work laws, to the extent that they reduce union dues, and there appears to be pretty good evidence that there's a number of workers who won't pay dues if they have the choice. Right-to-work laws reduce the resources the government unions have, and thus make it more difficult for them to put their political allies in office and get these sweetheart contracts. And I do find that that has an effect on the numbers, that it's about 3 to 5% lower wages, depending on the specification I used, in the government sector. But in the private sector, there was nothing, just nothing. I mean, the numbers were basically negative 0.1% to positive 0.5% across the different specifications. None of them statistically significant. So while the formal mechanism of right to work applies the same in government and the private sector, they do have differential impacts in those two sectors. And I think we have time for one more question. Or not? All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you.